Dr. Tkacz is currently Bernard J. Coughlin, S.J., that's Societas Jesus, or Son of Jesus, Professor of Christian Philosophy at Gonzaga University. Dr. Tkacz's technical research in medieval philosophy has been published in various scholarly journals and in book-length collections of essays. And of course, needing to earn a living as a professor of logic, he also has a very fine book, The Second Liberal Art, A Guide to Traditional Logic. Dr. Tkacz will be the first to tell you that he's not as voluminous a writer as his wife, Dr. Tkacz. But reading his work, which I still see as greatly impressive in terms of volume, you will see quickly that he's made optimal use of his time, publishing at the highest scholarly level on topics and texts that are most important in the history of philosophy and for the perennial dialogue in the tradition. Dr. Tkac's works present the truths of philosophy from past thinkers, especially St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert the Great, in a manner that's intelligible and significant to the contemporary intellect. That, by the way, is an original contribution in itself, in spite of what our analytic colleagues will say. And he offers original developments in the tradition with discoveries in the history of philosophy and science and solutions to philosophical problems connected especially to the issues of faith and reason, the Christian doctrine of creation, and the development of scientific methodology in the life sciences from Aristotle through Albert the Great and into modern and contemporary thought. One of his most recent works, actually, Christopher, do you see my laptop bag? Oh, it's right here. I'm sorry, I'm going to step down real quick. I have the prop with me. Oh, it's right here. Here we go. Sorry. So one of his most important recent works is a volume of essays pertaining to the history of philosophy and science by the Dominican Father William Wallace. The volume is entitled The Intelligibility of Nature, a William Wallace Reader. And here it is, got a very beautiful cover. It's Catholic University of Press also. I highly recommend it. And if you look down here in the fine print, you'll see that some guy from northwest Montana with mud on his boots named Dan Wagner co-edited the volume, which is kind of cool. Father Wallace, Dr. Tkac's teacher, made important contributions regarding the relation of faith and reason and the compatibility of science and religion, and he demonstrated the continuity of modern science with the classical Aristotelian tradition via St. Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. This volume makes his important work on these topics, and I think he's the best Thomas simply at this, available to scholars and lay alike. A point of historical importance, in 1960, Father William Wallace gave the dedication speech for our own Albertus Magnus Hall of Science. It was entitled St. Albert and Modern Science, where he taught us how Albert's solution to problems surrounding the relationship between science and faith in the 13th century are relevant for us now in attacking similar problems. I want to say that Dr. Tkacz is not merely a teacher to me, he's a model par excellence for living the vocation of the professor-scholar. He taught me and he showed me that not only are rigorous scholarship and devoted and effective teaching compatible, they each achieve their perfection in, I stole this from John Deely, mutual fecundation. I'll let you think about what that means. I am then deeply honored and pleased to have him here today to present his work. What's so great about Albert the Great? His life, times, and contributions to Western civilization. I think Father Wallace would be most pleased to have him here tonight as a follow-up to his address at Albertus Magnus in 1960. Okay, thank you. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wagner, for that wonderful introduction. He asked me earlier if I minded whether His introduction was a little bit longer than usual, and I said, that's fine with me, provided you're going to give an encomium. I'm pleased he did. I will, because I'm his mentor, I have the privilege of grading him, of course, and we meet privately later, and I'll let you know what your grade is. Well, I'm very pleased to address you here at Aquinas College on this topic. If there's any appropriate venue in the United States for a talk like this, it's here. Given that anyone who knows anything about Aquinas College and its history already has some idea of just who Albertus Magnus was. Nonetheless, I will ask the question and explain what prompts the question, just what's so great about Albert the Great. My question was originally prompted by a remark made by that eminent historian of the Middle Ages, Etienne Gilson. He once said that the medieval scholar Albert is far less known than he is celebrated. And how true that is. A lot of people, educated people, have some sense that, yeah, there was this guy, Albert, who lived back in medieval times, and he was great, and he's important. What was it he did again? Indeed, if people know Albert at all today, it's as the teacher of this man, right? St. Thomas Aquinas. Yet this was not the situation in Albert's own day. In those days, Albert's fame was far greater than that of his student and fellow Dominican friar, Thomas. While Thomas was still a young and relatively little-known theologian, Albert already bore the title Magnus the Great, right, on account of his vast learning. For an indication of just how rare such a distinction was in those days, we need only consult the published comments of that great gossip of the 13th century, Roger Bacon. There he is, Friar Bacon. With clear outrage and perhaps a bit of envy, Roger complained that most students in his day, and even some very learned men, consider that the complete contents of philosophy, in fully developed form, have already been handed down in the Latin language by a man considered as much an authority as the great philosophers Avicenna, Averroes, and even Aristotle himself. And this man is accorded all this authority, even though he's still alive. Bacon clearly considered this an unprecedented indecency. Well, whatever Bacon's complaints, there was no denying Albert's great learning and his substantial contributions to the intellectual life of his time. Many today have some vague notion that these contributions are important, even groundbreaking, although, as Professor Gilson noted, few know exactly what those contributions are. As it happens, Albert lived at a crucial time in the history of Western philosophy and Western science. He had a long life that extended through the better part of the 13th century, dying at the age of 80. Now, before telling you about Albert's life and the story of his pivotal role in the development of Western civilization, let's first take a look at his resume, and get an overview of who the man was. Now, I've set up a resume here in the modern form so you can see something of his accomplishments. Now, you can see from this that Albert was a well-educated man. He studied the liberal arts at the University of Padua in northern Italy, completing his Bachelor of Arts degree in 1223. He later went on to study theology at the University of Paris, completing a Bachelor of Theology in 1245 and a Master of Theology in 1243, and then 1245 he completed his master's degree. He held a number of important academic positions. He was a lecturer in theology at the University of Paris, and then later Regent Master of Theology at Paris. At the medieval University of Paris, the rank of Regent Master is equivalent to full professor in a modern American university. Later, he became Regent Master of Theology at the Dominican School of Theology at Cologne. Now, Albert was a religious man. He was a Dominican friar and a priest, and he held a number of important religious and ecclesiastical appointments. He took his profession in the Order of Preachers at Cologne in 1224. And we don't know exactly when he was ordained, but it would have been a few years after that, after he had completed the basic Dominican course in theology mandated at that time. Later, he became rector of the new Dominican Theological Studium at Cologne, which he had founded, and also served for a few years as provincial of the German Dominican province. In 1260, Pope Alexander appointed him Bishop of Regensburg, a job which Albert did not like. We'll say more about that later. But he faithfully served as bishop of that see until 1264, when he retired his pontifical position. But he continued to serve as a consultant for both the papacy and the Dominican general, most notably when the Pope sent him to the Diocese of Strasbourg in 1268 as a formal papal reporter to solve a dispute there between the bishop and the town burghers. Now, I've already mentioned Albert's informal honorific, the Great, which he was given during his own lifetime. It was never formally conferred, but people began to refer to him that way, right? Which is what upset Friar Bacon so much. But he did get formally conferred honors much later. In 1931, Pope Pius XI canonized Albert and declared him to be a doctor of the church. And Pius' successor in 1941 declared Albert to be the patron saint of natural scientists. Now, Albert had a very productive intellectual life. And we won't go through right now all his many, many publications. Dr. Wagner mentioned my embarrassment comparing my publication output to that of my wife, who was very prolific. Both of us pale or color in embarrassment when we compare ourselves to a scholar like Albert, and you'll see why in just a moment. He published over 100 books, right? What we would nowadays call a book, on all different kinds of subjects. I've listed them here, and we won't go through them in detail right now, but just to give you a rough idea of how prolific this man was. Now remember, he was not just an academic. right? He was also a religious man with religious and ecclesiastical duties as well as academic ones. So this is really a massive achievement. But he published numerous commentaries on the scriptures, many theological works, commentaries on the church fathers, most especially the works of the father we now call the Pseudo-Dionysius. He published his university sermons, many logical works, works on ethics, metaphysics. He published in mathematics. He published a commentary on the geometry of Euclid, and many, many works on the natural sciences. And here I've listed them for you in the order that Albert produced them. But you can see there are many, many, page after page. Okay? And we'll say more about that in just a bit. Now, the story of Albert's impact on Western civilization essentially begins in the year 1249. That was the year marked by an important development in Albert's intellectual career, and, as we shall soon see, in intellectual history as well. That was the year that Albert finally acceded to the pleas of his Dominican confreres to compose a work on the natural science of Aristotle. Right? This man. Okay? Now, today we tend to associate Aristotle with the disciplines of logic, ethics, political theory, metaphysics. Yet throughout antiquity and into the Middle Ages, Aristotle was mostly known for his contributions to natural science. Indeed, well over half of Aristotle's books are devoted to studies of nature. 25% of his work is devoted to zoology alone. It was Aristotle who first defined and established the form and practice of a scientific research program. And thereby he earned the title Father of Modern Science. Now, Albert's Dominican students had been imploring him to write a primer on Aristotle's natural science for a good many years. This was while Albert was a professor of theology at the University of Paris. Albert had come to Paris in 1243, living at the Priory of Saint-Jacques in the University District, and giving university lectures under the direction of the Dominican theologian Guéric of Saint-Quentin. In 1245, Albert succeeded Guéric and held his professorship until 1248. It was during the time of his professorship when Albert's primary duty was to lecture on the scriptures that his young confreres began to ask him to compose an introduction to Aristotle's books on nature. So it's clear that Albert had already established a reputation as an expert in the natural sciences, even though he was a professional theologian. Albert was a busy man, though, and his duties on the theology faculty at Paris were pressing. He managed to put off the brothers for 3 years until the Dominican Master General ordered him to resign his professorship at Paris and proceed to Cologne to establish a school of theology there. This is quite an important event in the history of academia because this advanced school of theology, it was a Dominican studium generale, as they termed it in those days, a school of theology to train young Dominicans for their lifetime as members of the Order of Preachers, right? That was their charism, was to preach, and for that they needed a theological education. This was important, though, because this institution was the first institution of higher education established in a German-speaking country. Right? So all these modern, august German universities all owe their remote beginnings to Albert's work as founding the school at Cologne. In many ways, I suppose you could say Albert deserves the title the father of the German university. So whatever the claims made on behalf of Heidegger and others, right? Having been asked by the Dominican general to establish this school, it was in the hot, dusty summer of 1248, after the ending of the spring term, the Easter term at Paris, that Albert, accompanied by a small band of young Dominican friars, that included the young Thomas Aquinas, by the way, made their way on foot along the old Roman road that led along the Rhine River to Cologne. Right? They arrived at the Priory of the Holy Cross at Cologne in early September in 1248. Back in those days, Dominicans, as part of their observance of their vow of poverty, always traveled on foot. It was contrary to the Dominican ordinances to travel by carriage or even by horseback. And so they walked from Paris to Cologne, as they walked everywhere else. So Dominicans were quite hardy in those days, right? Indeed. It was during the following year, 1249, that Albert began his work on the long-requested guide to Aristotle's work in the sciences of nature. Here's Albert as Regent Master of Theology at Cologne. Little did the friars know that their pleas for an introductory textbook in natural science were to set in motion a momentous intellectual project. The work that Albert initially produced was a commentary explaining Aristotle's Physics, a treatise on the general principles of nature. Yet what Albert was actually setting out to do was far more extensive, for he intended this commentary to be the first part of what would become one of the major literary productions of the Middle Ages, an achievement upon which Albert's later reputation as the foremost expert on the empirical sciences would rest. The significance of this event lies in the fact that Albert, who had been trained in theology and mandated by his religious superiors to prepare young men to take up sacred studies, had additionally decided to devote himself to the long-term project of producing research in the natural sciences. This is clear from the beginning of his commentary on the Physics, where Albert declares that he is setting out to make the new learning of Aristotle intelligible to Latin readers. Indeed, Albert's plan, here you have the quote, a partial quotation from the preface to that work, right? So you can see clearly right from the start, Albert intended this long-term project, right? And he intended to make all the disciplines, all the sciences, intelligible to Latin readers. Okay? Albert went on, having produced this elementary guide to Aristotle's physics, Albert went on to compose a systematic and learned treatment of the whole of human knowledge. Albert treated in orderly fashion all the natural sciences, both the celestial sciences and the terrestrial sciences. In addition, he wrote on mathematics, logic, rhetoric, ethics, economics, politics, and metaphysics. Albert intended all this from the start and carried out his plan in a deliberate and systematic way, following the established order of Aristotle's books. As you can see, most of these books were devoted to the empirical sciences, right? So here we have a list of the books that Albert was writing commentaries on or writing treatises related to, right? So the very first one, the Physica, is a commentary on Aristotle's physics. That was the promised work. But he went on to write other works. He's got a work on the heavens there, right, on cosmology, a work on geography, on geomorphology, a science that Albert was the first to systematically contribute to, on the nature of matter, on atmospheric phenomena, right, commentary on Aristotle's meteorology, an original treatise on mineralogy, a very important work on the soul, and then a whole series of work on various biological functions in animals, right? Everything from sensation and memory to sleep and aging. You can see the list there. He wrote a book on botany based on ancient sources, and a massive contribution to the science of zoology that included not only learned commentaries on all of Aristotle's zoological works, but original zoological research done since Aristotle's time, some of which was done by Albert himself. Albert's procedure here, before we get to look at manuscripts, Albert's procedure in commenting on Aristotle's books on natural science was to first report on Aristotle's original research, describing his methods and conclusions. Albert, however, didn't stop there, for he extended and updated Aristotle at every turn. He even corrected Aristotle in places. To Aristotle's extensive zoological studies, for example, Albert added an equally extensive study of species that Aristotle and his original students did not know, including some that were based on Albert's own personal zoological research. Albert added books on whole sciences not treated by Aristotle, like his book on mineralogy, for example, but books that were clearly needed to complete the Aristotelian program that Albert assumed that Aristotle just never got around to doing. These included books on mineralogy, as I already mentioned, geography, geomorphology, some atmospheric studies to supplement Aristotle's meteorology, and others. In addition, Albert provided careful studies of Aristotle's scientific method, showing how Aristotle had established the essential nature of a scientific research program and hence established the canons of scientific method. Albert is really the first in the history of science to do this. Aristotle himself initiated this work by raising these questions and asking, well, how does one come to know nature, and addressing these issues in his logical works. Albert was the first to look at that and say, what Aristotle has accomplished here is essentially an outline of what any scientist needs to do in order to unlock the secrets of nature. And he understood this as a programmatic effort, which is a commonplace now. Think of great modern scientific efforts where you have a lot of people working on a scientific problem together with a lot of support, not always even in the same place, maybe in different venues, all for a common scientific goal. The Manhattan Project during World War II would be an excellent example of that, one that a lot of people know about. But there are many, many others, right? The Human Genome Project that's currently going on today would be another contemporary example of that. Albert really was the first to sort of define this based on Aristotle's work of what this is how scientific research proceeds and is productive. Right? Albert intended all this, that he was going to codify all this in his published writings right from the start of his publication career. Right, his career in commenting on Aristotle. And this is revealed by the manuscript evidence. Now, unfortunately, I don't have great photographs of the manuscripts, and even if I did, you probably couldn't read it unless you've spent a number of years studying Latin paleography. Right? I've spent a few years studying Latin paleography, and I have trouble making out what's on the page here, but one can do that. This is a photograph of an autograph manuscript of Albert's containing his Aristotelian commentaries. It's held in the Österreichische Nationalbibliothek at Vienna, and it shows that Albert's Aristotelian commentaries were written consecutively in the order of Aristotle's works as then arranged. Now remember, this is an autograph, so this is Albert's own hand. This is not the work of some scribe. So clearly this is what Albert intended, right? Now, what I have showing you here is folio 72 verso, which contains at the top of the page, you can barely see it, unfortunately my photograph was cut off, but there are the last 5 lines of his commentary on Aristotle's physics. And then you see he begins right away on the very same folio with the beginning of the De Caelo, the treatise on the heavens, which is the next book in the Aristotelian ordering, okay? Now, this book ends at folio 142 recto, and is immediately followed by the next book in order, the De Natura Locorum, right? It's a little bit difficult to see here, but if you notice in the margin, about almost 2/3 of the way down, you see in the right margin the word explicit, right, indicating the end of a work, right? And that's the last line, that marks the last line of the De Caelo. And then on the very next line, you see over there in the left margin, the little paragraph mark in the margin. That marks the beginning of the De Natura Locorum. So again, right, Albert is going right into the next one. So clearly he intended all this as a unified project, right? Right from the start. And this manuscript at Vienna goes all the way through all the Aristotelian commentaries, ending with the last one, the last book of Albert's De Animalibus, which is his longest work of 27 books. And it includes commentaries on the longest of Aristotle's zoological treatises, plus the original zoological work that Albert added to the end. He's got 6 books at the end with original work. Albert's ambitious and comprehensive plan was carried out in accordance with a carefully defined understanding of the place of scientific learning in Christian culture. Just how integral to the Christian worldview Albert considered empirical studies is reflected in the seminary curriculum he established at Cologne. Now remember that the Dominican general sent Albert, who was an active professor of theology at the University of Paris, the general said to Albert, resign your professorship and go to Cologne and establish a new school of theology. And in establishing that, of course, he got to set up the curriculum and become its first professor, right? Now, he used the university curriculum as kind of a model for the School of Theology at Cologne. But he was given freedom to arrange the curriculum in the way he thought best, right? The Dominican general trusted Albert, Professor Albert, right, Master Albert, to set up the right kind of program to train young Dominicans in theology. Now, the primary sources for theological study in those days were, of course, the scriptures, right? And the work of the ancient church fathers, right? Augustine was commonly read, sometimes Ambrose, sometimes where Latin translations of the Greek fathers were available. They had Latin translations of John Chrysostom, Origen, some of the Cappadocian works of Cappadocian fathers, and so forth. So these were the normal theological curriculum in universities. Albert adopted that, but added to that the study of Aristotle's books on the various disciplines that Aristotle had studied. An example of this, and these included books on the natural sciences, right? An example of this is during the academic year 1257-1258, we have a record of what exactly Albert was doing at Cologne, right? And this is typical of what we know about his curriculum at Cologne. During that academic year, Albert supplemented his lectures on the Gospels. He gave lectures on the Gospel of Matthew and on the beginning of the Gospel of John. During that time, he supplemented them with lectures on Aristotle's zoological treatises, guiding his students in replicating some of Aristotle's original experiments, right? And involving the students in some of Albert's own original zoological observations. They went out and did field studies, right? Clearly, Albert considered that those preparing for the priesthood not only required a knowledge of scriptures, but also an appreciation of the order and intelligibility of nature. Right? So this was a new approach at the time, and we owe this to Albert. Now, in order to properly understand Albert's ambitious project and its meaning, it's necessary to see it in the historical context in which it was conceived and carried out. During the decades preceding Albert's birth, in the year 1200, a momentous event took place in intellectual history. This was the recovery in the Latin West of the books of the ancient Greek philosophers, mathematicians, and medical scholars. Significantly, these included the works of Aristotle, who had been the most important contributor to logic and the empirical sciences. Among the Greeks, and his works constituted a virtual encyclopedia of the ancient achievement in the natural sciences. All this literature became available in the Latin language within the space of about a generation. They began to trickle in the early decades of the 12th century. The availability of these books in Latin, Latin translations from the Arabic and Latin translations directly from the Greek, really picked up after about 1145, and that was the high point. By about 1210, they had just about everything. Right? I think the last works translated from the Arabic to complete the Aristotelian corpus that, as we now know it, were translated in 1217, for example. Okay, that gives you an idea. Well, that's roughly a generation of scholars. Okay, and so all this, it's a relatively short space of time in the scholarly time, right? And this caused great excitement. Latin-speaking scholars felt that new vistas of learning and scholarship were being opened to them that were not conceived of before, or were just set aside before in favor of a purely theological higher education based on the work of the fathers. Right? Now, all this happened at the same time that the early universities were established, right? So for the first time, we have institutions devoted entirely to the acquisition of knowledge, established at the same time that all this new knowledge is coming in. The combination of these two historical events brought about a scientific revolution, as scholars appropriated Aristotle's scientific method and put it to use in discovering the secrets of nature. Aristotle's scientific treatises provided the example and the foundation for new research, and Aristotle's logical works provided the methodology by which such research could proceed. The result was nothing less than the initiation of the ongoing tradition of experimental science that continues today. So this is why I call it a scientific revolution. I like to tell my modernist colleagues that the real scientific revolution occurred around the year 1200, not at the time of Galileo, around the year 1600, right? And indeed, Galileo himself would have said something like that because he was aware that he was working in an already established tradition of experimental science. Right? He knew the work of Albert and the other experimentalists of the 13th century and was building on their work. He even refers to them in his writings. Among the experimental work done by medieval natural philosophers at this time were experiments in optics, and mechanics, and statics, animal embryology, the experimental modeling of atmospheric phenomena, and many other scientific projects as well. Scientific investigators during this period discovered the laws of perspective and magnification, the optical properties of luminant events in the atmosphere, the biological adaptation of organisms, the formation of landforms due to wind and water erosion, as well as other observed phenomena. Albert himself worked on many of these areas himself. Progress was also made in the various modes of physical measurement and classification, especially in the earth sciences and the life sciences. All these were inspired and modeled after the empirical researches of Aristotle. So this reception of Aristotle's new science at the time brought about a great upsurgence of activity in scientific experimentation and scientific investigation. Now, before the reception of Aristotle's science in the then newly established universities, higher education had been mostly confined to theology. The 7 liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, numerical proportions, and mathematical astronomy, they were studied in the early medieval schools, like the monastic schools, for example, as a preparation for advanced theological studies. This radically changed, though, with the recovery of Aristotle's books. For the first time, European scholars had access to an extensive body of empirical studies as well as detailed accounts of scientific method with its promise of future scientific progress. This resulted in the scientific revolution that I've referred to, initiating the common use of experimental methods upon which modern science was eventually based. Albert was an important figure in this intellectual revolution. He was not the only one doing this kind of work, but he was one of the most important and prolific scholars of his time doing this sort of work. Because he wrote detailed commentaries on all of Aristotle's empirical research, Albert was acknowledged as a leading proponent of the new science of Aristotle, hence his title Magnus the Great. Thanks to Albert's contributions, scientific research became established as the primary way in which human knowledge is attained. See, Albert had the view that human knowledge was not first theological. We don't know God first. Human knowledge is first about nature, and it's only through nature that we come to know God. This is a view that he passed on to his most famous student, Thomas Aquinas, who defends that view among his fellow theologians of the time. In addition to the many scientific fields that are today well established, many of these were originally established as research disciplines by Albert's groundbreaking work. This is especially true in the life sciences and the earth sciences. Albert's books on these sciences remained a primary source for scientific researches for centuries, well beyond the time of Galileo and into our modern era. We can attain an idea of Albert's contributions to experimental science by looking at some of the research he pursued with the help of his students at the Dominican Studium at Cologne. Among the many biological experiments referenced in Albert's books on animal science is his replication of some of Aristotle's original embryological experiments. Perhaps the most famous of these are the chicken embryo experiments. Here's a list of the works of Albert Aristotle that came into Latin in the 12th century. You see, these are categories of Aristotle's books. The only books previous to the 12th century that Latin readers had available was called the Logica Vetus. It was a sum of Aristotle's logical works that had been translated back in Roman times by Boethius, right? At the very end of the 5th century, beginning of the 6th century. Then in the 12th century, the rest of Aristotle's logical works became available in Latin translation, and that was known as the Logica Nova, right, the new logic. And then there were the books on nature, right, the natural science books, and that was most of the corpus. And then there were the books that were known as the books on politics. This includes Aristotle's work on virtues, so his ethical work, the Nicomachean Ethics, the Eudaimonean Ethics, his work on economics, and his work on his famous book, The Politics on Political Theory, and then his work in metaphysics. So it gives you a rough idea of what was in the Aristotelian corpus recovered during that time. Well, here's the illustration of the chicken egg experiment. Now, this illustration, it's a little bit difficult to see. I took it from an illustration of a 16th century work on embryology that's based on Albert's De Animalibus, where he describes Aristotle's experiment, right? And the writer here tried to illustrate what he clearly replicated the experiment again and illustrated what he had done here. And that this is the earliest, so this is from an early printed book. It's a little bit difficult to see. The reproduction isn't very well, but you can see what we have here is a series of chicken eggs at different stages of gestation. Okay, common species of chicken gestate within a relatively short time, about 20 days. So you can do a reasonable, manageable kind of experiment, observational experiment, in noting the stages of development of the chicken embryo inside the egg. The trick is in an experimental technique. How do you get access and good look at the embryo so you can catalog the different stages of development, right? And apparently Aristotle and his original students, and this was replicated by Albert and his students at Cologne, found a way to use a very sharp scalpel to score one end of the eggshell and lift it off the embryonic sac, right, the membrane inside, in such a way that the membrane was not broken, so that the embryo inside was undisturbed, right? It's the problem we all have when we boil eggs and try to shell them, right? Except there, of course, we're not concerned about the well-being of the embryo so that we can observe it clearly. If you do the technique skillfully, you can manage it. And then by having a good source of light, then you can observe the embryo at different stages of development. You take an egg at a different day of gestation, right? Up to 20 days, which is right before hatching. They were able to then observe and catalog, describe when the different forms in the chicken embryo came into existence and were formed, right? So they figured out when the heart was formed and the rest of the circulatory system. They tracked the nervous system. They didn't quite understand how the nervous system works, since electricity had not been discovered yet, but they knew that there was a nervous system, right? And they were able to track its development and so on and so forth, okay? It's really a very nice piece of observational experimentation. And this gives you an idea that this is serious science going on here, right? Even at this early stage in the history of experimentation. Albert also describes an experimental work that he did in veterinary medicine, and I won't go into detail here because we don't have time, but the story is that the stable master of the German Emperor Frederick became quite worried when an infectious disease of horses spread through the stables. Now, Frederick was a consummate collector of fine horse flesh, right? He loved horses, and he had these massive stables. The joke at the emperor's court among the courtiers were that the emperor's horses lived better than we do. You know, the stables were massive, and they were well attended, and they have a huge staff of stable attendants. So anyway, the stable master, he became really worried when all these valuable horses came into jeopardy because a respiratory disease was spreading, and clearly an infectious disease, was spreading through the stables. At the time, the collection included 2 pure white Arabian stallions, which had been given to Emperor Frederick as a gift from the Sultan, right? So you can imagine why the stable master was so worried. So he was at his wit's end. He couldn't figure out how the disease was being spread, and therefore how to isolate the horses from each other in a way that would prevent the spread of disease. So he called on Friar Albert, right? He writes a letter to Cologne, and clearly Albert had this, reputation, right? And Albert agreed to come and study the situation. Well, through a series, I don't have time to describe them in detail, but through a series of brilliant inductive experiments, Albert was able to find out that what was being done is that what was happening was that horses were exchanging bodily fluids in a variety of different ways. Right? A horse would urinate on some straw, and then another horse would come and sit in it. Right? Or a horse would leave a little bit of discharge from a minor wound on a post, and another horse would brush by against it. Saliva would drip, and all these different ways in which horses might exchange bodily fluids. And Albert was able to figure out there's something about the fluid transformation or exchange that was conveying this form of cholera. The disease in question is what we now call equine cholera. Right? And so he was able to instruct the stable master on just what to do to isolate the horses, and he saved that valuable collection of horses and no doubt the stable master's head as well. We know that many of Albert's students went on to do experiments themselves using the methods they learned from Master Albert. These included here's Albert as experimenter, right? These included experiments in optics and atmospheric phenomena and others. Most famous, the Dominican friar Theodoric of Freiburg. This is the Swiss Freiburg, where the Dominicans had a priory in those days. He worked out the optical properties behind the production of both the primary and secondary rainbow. Right? And it's a brilliant piece of scientific modeling using glass flasks to represent drops of water suspended in the atmosphere. Right? And he worked out the optical properties and recorded them. Often Descartes is given credit for working out the optics of the rainbow production, but in fact, Theodoric had them all worked out centuries before Descartes. Theodoric lived at the very end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. And he learned this from Albert, right? He learned his science from Albert. Well, no wonder by the time of his death in 1280, Albert had an established reputation as the leading empirical scientist of his time. Here's one of the optical drawings from a description of an experiment. This is not from Theodoric's book. This is from a different book, but clearly a student of Albert. I think it comes from Italy. I forget. I lost my note on that. But you can see we have modern-like optical drawings, right? Labeled in Latin notation there. Albert lived a long and productive life. He remained faithful to his religious vows and his life of prayer, following the rule of St. Dominic. He also faithfully served the church as a hierarch and priest, right? We can just take a quick look at Albert's life. We don't have time to go through all this in great detail, but he was born in southern Germany, in Swabia, at Lauingen. In his day, he was often known as Albert of Lauingen, and studied liberal arts at Padua. In 1223, received into the order of preachers, did his novitiate at Heiliger Kreuz, the Dominican friary there in Cologne, and completed his theological studies there. Even during this early time in his life, before he went to the University of Paris, you'll see he was already doing serious scientific research. Most notably, notice in 1235, right around that time, he got permission from his Dominican superiors to take some time out to go visit the mines in the Hartz Mountains to the east of the closest Dominican priory. And he there cataloged mineral samples that the miners were digging up. And it's the first serious attempt at mineralogical cataloging that we know about, right? And this was later the basis for Albert's own work, De Mineralibus, original work on mineralogy. So you can see that work was already going on even before he went to Paris. So in the 1240s, he's at Paris, as already described, and then he goes to Cologne to establish the Studium Generale there, begins his massive commentary project on Aristotle, and holds a number of positions in the order during that time, but also continues his work in scientific study. Here's an image of Albert as Bishop of Regensburg, right? This is in 1260, the Pope appointed him bishop. He clearly had a reputation as a reliable administrator and theologian. And apparently the Diocese of Regensburg was in bad shape, and Albert was sent. He didn't like being put in this position, but he was sent to clean up the mess, essentially, right? And so he audited the books, dealt with the theological issues, made sure all the parish priests were preaching soundly, and so on and so forth, right? But Albert's real love was scholarship and prayer, right? He longed to get back to the friary. So he kept telling the Pope he wanted to resign. The Pope said, no, I still need you there, stay there. Well, finally in 1264, the Pope let him go. Albert retires. He goes to the priory, I think it was at Würzburg. But even while he was bishop, he was doing scholarly work in the sciences. He did much of his work on the De Animalibus, his longest massive work, while he was bishop at Regensburg. It's how he found the time, I have no clue. He doesn't explain, right? Okay, well, we can go past some of the details. Finally, after retiring as a bishop, and he continued to serve as a papal consultant, but in 1269 he retires for good, and he goes to the Priory of the Holy Cross up there in Cologne. He gets the title of Theological Lector Emeritus, but he doesn't really have to lecture except when he feels like it, because he's an old guy by this time, right? And he does a few things, but he finally, in November of 1280, he dies, right? In 1931, he was canonized a saint and declared to be a doctor of the church, and in 1941, Pope Pius XII declares Albert to be the patron saint of natural scientists, right? So this long, productive life, a faithful life of a hierarch and a priest, a follower of St. Dominic and his rule, and a pursuer of research of all the disciplines of knowledge, especially those concerning the natural world, right, the created world. He was tremendously influential, not only because he was helped to establish the experimental tradition that, of course, is the center of our intellectual life today, but also he had more immediate influences. His theological work not only produced numerous generations of learned Dominican friars, including St. Thomas, one of the most learned and greatest theologians, but also he influenced mystical theology, and a school of mystical theology in the Rhineland grew up in the century following Albert's death. And these are sometimes called the Rhineland mystics, right? And they took, Albert's theological works were a great inspiration to them. And then a little bit later on in the 16th century, Albert's works were studied as a foundation for research in the natural science. They were studied by the early Jesuits at the Jesuit Roman College, and their notes on Albert and their lectures on Albert's work on natural science were read by Galileo and appropriated by Galileo as his experimental methodology. This has been established by historians of science, including my mentor, Father William Wallace, a Dominican friar himself, and a great Galileo scholar. And this is now accepted view. So the old image of Galileo founding modern science by throwing Aristotle out the window and starting over is just wrong, right? Galileo was aware of the fact he was working in an established tradition of experimental science that went back to Albert. And it was precisely Albert's form of Aristotelianism that Galileo had appropriated in his own experimental work. This is to take nothing away from the innovations of Galileo himself. He was a great innovator and experimenter. He deserves the title Father of Modern Science, but he's not the father of experimental science, right? Albert deserves that title as much as anyone else, right? And this is now well established. If you're interested, I can give you details of the evidence for this, okay? But it's well accepted now by historians of science. So Albert's principal contribution, though, to the medieval scientific revolution is not simply his dissemination and extension of Aristotle's empirical study. Others of his time were doing that kind of work as well. Albert did more of it than anyone, but others were involved as well. But it's the fact that, as the medievalist Ferdinand von Steenbergen pointed out, that Albert's special merit lies in the fact that he was the first scholar to define the rightful place of scientific learning in Christianity. This was a point of view that Albert passed on to his most talented student, Thomas Aquinas, whose achievements were the demonstration that scientific knowledge of nature is both compatible with and supportive of Christian doctrine. Thomas learned his science from Albert and knew it very well. He himself was not interested in pursuing scientific research. He was more your thoroughgoing theologian. But Albert's approach to science and his immersion in the hands-on research involved in empirical studies influenced St. Thomas, so that St. Thomas realized that this is what God made human beings to know, is nature. This is what we know first and what we know best. And we know God through nature, so we must study nature. And when we do study nature, then we see that what is revealed to us in sacred doctrine is true. Right? Our reason comes together with revelation in a grand synthesis. And anyone who has read St. Thomas knows of his synthetic talents, right, in his philosophy. And this was what the synthesis at the heart was all about. And this was due to Albert's influence. Well, that all this is true was not lost, or has not been lost on the church, right? The meaning of Albert's intellectual project has been appreciated by the church, right? In 1931, Pope Pius canonized Albert, declared him to be a doctor of the church. Later, during the dark days of World War II, Pope Pius XII declared Albert to be the patron saint of those who devote himself to research in the natural sciences, at a sad time when learning was being used to bring about suffering and destruction. The Pope suggested a different place for science and human affairs by proposing Albert as a model for the natural scientists, a model for how science and faith can flourish harmoniously in human culture. In fact, it's worth taking a close look at the Pope's words. His declaration was in an apostolic letter that was released in December of 1941, so right in the middle of World War II, right? This is what the Pope had to say in part. We are moved by the sad state of affairs in our day when the latest advances of science are employed, unhappily, not for God's praise and man's salvation, but to visit the calamities of war even upon civilian centers and cities. May St. Albert, who in his own very difficult times proved by his wonderful work that science and faith can flourish harmoniously in men, through his powerful intercession with God, arouse the hearts and minds of those who devote themselves to the sciences to a peaceful and orderly use of the natural forces, the laws of which, divinely established, they investigate and seek after. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tkacz. We have some time for some questions, if you have any. Yeah, please. I'll let you feel.
Looking at the list of some of the texts that you showed us on the slides, the slide in particular where you divided the theological and the philosophical works, philosophical dominated by Aristotle's natural philosophy. The theological treatise, we have the gospel commentaries, but then I think just below that, you have the commentaries on Pseudo-Dionysius.
Right.
There's so much I'd like to ask about that, but here's the question I want to ask. On the face of it, it would seem as if Pseudo-Dionysius is kind of an eccentric interest for Albert.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. Albert was really the first to use Dionysius as part of a theological curriculum, something like the kind of curriculum the university faculties of theology were doing. See, most of the university faculties at the time, if they used any of the church fathers as subjects of direct lecture, it was usually Augustine, right? He was the big one in the Latin West. Occasionally you found people who would lecture on Ambrose, especially the theological commentaries, the scripture commentaries of Ambrose. And occasionally some of the Greeks. You do have lectures on Origen and like the sermons of John Chrysostom, that sort of thing. Again, mostly as a way of exegizing scripture, because these fathers would address scriptural passages or scriptural issues. The use of the Pseudo-Dionysius was Albert's innovation, yes. It wasn't that absolutely nobody, people had been reading the Pseudo-Dionysius, he was known, but he was not part of the curriculum the way Albert made him. And Albert made a kind of a centerpiece at Cologne, and that was innovative too. Yeah.
Well, I'm just wondering, I know that the opening sentences of Aquinas' commentary on the divine names, names, speaks of the two modes of ascent to the knowledge of God, from creatures and from ignorance. And I'm just wondering if maybe Dionysius played a central role for Albert specifically in justifying this attention to creatures, because it would be a pathway, it would thereby be explainable as a pathway of ascent.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't definitively answer that. Perhaps. Clearly he knew Dionysius well. He certainly thinks that the view he's getting from, or that he's developing on the basis of his interest in the new Aristotelian science is consonant with Dionysius. Whether that's his primary source for that view, I don't know. That's an interesting question. Maybe there's some scholar who's addressed that or could address that. That'd be an interesting issue. Yes?
Thank you so much for the presentation. I want to go back to the Dominican Studio General because you were talking about the fact that they have the theological studies and Aristotelian natural sciences. And I know that later when the Jesuits did their own curriculum for their Studium Generale, they had Aristotelian science, because that was important for students to go through that before they became theologians. And so I wanted to ask if the point of Albert's development of the sciences had to do with the work of theologians doing biblical exegesis, because by the time you get to Galileo, he wants to say, well, you can perfectly well reinterpret the passages of the Bible to make it coincide with the Copernican worldview. And so he was taking over the role of the theologians because he was not himself a professional theologian. So I want to know if Albert Aguirre was the one kind of saw in science as a maid servant of theology, a route to better interpret the metaphors and the ambiguity of the sacred text, who is then going to sort of legitimize itself by using the best science of the time to do the correct
Yes, that view expressed by Galileo, and he does it in several places, some of his own work, but also his correspondence with Cardinal Bellarmine, for example, and their discussions on this issue. This was nothing new. Sometimes people portray this as a new theological insight on the part of Galileo. Well, it hardly was. This was in the tradition going back to the Fathers. This idea of the synthesis of faith and reason and one supporting the other. I mean, you find it in Augustine, you find it in the Cappadocian Fathers, the work of John of Damascus, for example, and so forth. Even the use of Aristotle's science. John of Damascus knew his Aristotle very well and talks about these kinds of issues. So the idea is an ancient one and was always part of the tradition. I think what Galileo is expressing there is, the debate at the time was whether or not we should abandon the geocentric cosmology, planetary system, because in favor of a heliocentric alternative, and there had been many heliocentric theories long before, going right back to Eudoxus and back in Plato's day, right? Cardinal Bellarmine said, well, that's fine, that won't jeopardize the faith, but you shouldn't push that view until you have the evidence for it, till you can, the technical term based on Aristotle was, till you have a demonstration of it, a formal demonstration, which Galileo did not have. In fact, Galileo never managed to get around to formulating it. He thought he was going to be able to do it on the basis of his study of the phases of the moon, right? And he thought that was going to show that the Earth had to be in motion around the sun, right? It turned out you can't show it that way, right? That's not what the evidence is. Now, he had other evidence that was not definitive, it didn't constitute a true demonstration, but were indications of that there were cracks in the geocentric theory, right? The stellar parallax, phases of Venus, and other things he was able to observe with his telescope, right? But Cardinal Bellarmine was just cautioning him, saying, until you can show that this telescopic evidence demonstrates that this received view is wrong, you shouldn't just go shooting your mouth off, right? I mean, especially if people are associating it with doctrine. Now, Bellarmine was quite open to saying that we have to, reassess what the teachings of the church mean if we get scientific evidence. And Bellarmine says that in his letters with Galileo. This is quite upfront. Our good friend and colleague, William Carroll, has studied this. William Carroll is a professor at Oxford University at Blackfriars College, and he's studied the correspondence between Bellarmine and Galileo on precisely these kinds of issues. And he's shown that Galileo was not challenging an accepted bit of Catholic theological interpretation or even Catholic doctrine, but rather Galileo was just being a little bit too quick because he was excited about his new telescopic evidence, and Bellarmine was cautioning him. That's fine. Get excited. This is great stuff. Keep up your good research, but don't go shooting off your mouth until you're really ready to nail the argument, right?
But the theologians themselves were the ones who were doing the interpretation, and they did not want an amateur like Galileo interfere precisely because of the lack of the evidence of Galileo.
That's true, although the situation is somewhat more complex. For one thing, most of I mean, you mentioned the Jesuits, right? The model for Jesuit thinking on this was established at the Collegium Romanum, that was established by Saint Ignatius in Rome as the model Jesuit school, right? The professors there were all, who dealt with these issues, were all scholastic natural philosophers who were schooled in the Aristotelianism of Albert and Thomas. And Galileo used their work. We know that definitively. Now, he developed his mechanics on the basis of their work. The debates there have to be set in the context of that. And, you know, also you got these were political issues with a lot of personalities involved, right? You know, Galileo was a hot-headed Italian, you know, and he said things that maybe he shouldn't have said, you know, at times he shouldn't have said it. So it's not that Galileo was not a great man. He was, right? He was a brilliant experimenter. He was right when other people were wrong, but he was also wrong when other people were right, too. Like all of us, right? I mean, nobody's right all the time, right? Even great people. And so one needs to put that in context, I would suggest.
I think that I'm going to moderate and say we will have time to talk with Dr. Tkacz a bit more if you'll join us at a reception at Holmdien, and we have food and libation, so please do that, and you can get a chance to talk to Dr. Tkacz more. Let's give Dr. Tkacz a round of applause. Thank you so much for your work.
Do I get to keep this?